Thank you, everyone, for joining up today. I head up, as Jeannie mentioned, Nielsen's beverage alcohol practice in the United States, and both myself and Matt Crompton will be reviewing U.S. cider trends in both the off and on-premise. A version of this is something that we presented at CiderCon 2017 in Chicago, and we were excited to be there and participate in it. I just wanted to quickly mention that, without getting into any kind of boring detail, perhaps, that very, very briefly, Nielsen does two things all around measurement. We measure what consumers watch, obviously things like the Nielsen ratings play in there, and the watch is inclusive of all devices and screens where content is consumed, including online. And then on the right-hand side, we measure what consumers buy, not just what they buy, but where they buy, when they buy it, at what price, along with a host of consumer behavior and purchasing dynamics and insights. So for today, we're primarily going to be focused on the right-hand side, on the consumer. The reality is that everything should start and end with consumers, because if we're not satisfying their needs and they're not buying, we're not all working in this great industry. Next slide. We're going to touch on each of these various topics. We're going to touch a little bit about just kind of, when I talk about our measurement of what the consumers are doing, a little bit more about what that is, just so you have some context for it. Secondly, we'll touch on how overall beverage alcohol is performing across beer, wines, and spirits. Then we'll drill down into how cider is performing and what's driving the growth of cider, who is the cider consumer and what are they saying about a few different topics, and then very briefly we'll touch on how is cider performing elsewhere, because Nielsen measures things not just in the U.S., but we're active in over 100 countries, and in many of those countries we have measurements of beverage alcohol and cider particularly. So next slide. So what we do when we do our measurements and what we're actually reporting on, we're gathering and we're reporting POS or scan, point of sale, retail sales to consumers. So we're measuring what the consumer is buying when they go into a store and buy it. So these are not shipments, they're not depletions, they're actual retail sales. We do that for your products down to the individual item level, as well as all of your competitors. So we're measuring every item that we can find that's sold in the store. Every one of those items is coded based on the characteristics of what's on the label, so that then we can aggregate things up for brands or product segments and up to the category level. We do that across a number of off-premise and on-premise channels, and I'll cover that in a couple minutes. We can report at a weekly level for off-premise, at a 4-weekly, so we'll aggregate 4 weeks together on the on-premise, but down to a weekly level for off-premise. We have a historical database of up to 3 or 5 years, depending on the channel, so that we can compare things like growth rates over the years. And then we have a variety of measures depending on the channel, things like sales in both volume and dollars, what price is paid by the consumer, what kind of distribution products have. And then for some channels, we can look at various causal factors like ads, displays, temporary price reductions, etc. And as I mentioned, we do that in a variety of countries around the world. Next. So the channels we measure, we are measuring on the off-premise side. So first of all, on the left-hand side, grocery stores across the country, same with drugstores, some matched merchandisers like Target, Walmart, the dollar channel, select club stores, inclusive of BJ's and Sam's. You'll notice that Costco is not there. And then we're excited that Whole Foods will be entering our measurement during the second quarter, which we're just starting of 2017. So at some point this quarter, we'll also have Whole Foods as part of our measurement. Convenience stores, military exchanges, and then we measure the liquor channel in several markets across the country, not all of the United States, but several markets, as well as about 15 or 16 liquor chain retailers. So to give you some examples, Beverages and More, Total Wine and More, Binny's, Specs, ABC Liquor, a number of the larger liquor chains are part of our reporting. In the on-premise, we're measuring both the eating or restaurants and drinking segments or bars. We do that at a total U.S. level, and then I'll show you the markets and regions that we're able to break down separately. And then lastly, we don't have this today, but we're working very, very hard on measuring e-commerce sales for not just cider, but all of the categories that Nielsen measures. And by the way, Nielsen measures about 125 different categories that consumers buy when they typically go into any one of these channels and make their purchases. So we're able to kind of we're able to show it separately and then bring it all of that together into an all-inclusive measurement. if we, just so you can get some idea of the regional looks that we can get to, if you go to the next slide, on the off-premise side, we're pretty well able to measure or to provide statistics at a state level for anything that's shown in green. So it gets obviously pretty deep. And then in some states, like a California or Florida or New York, and you can see some of the other ones, we're able to go down a little bit deeper into local markets. So on the off-premise side, which we've been doing for many, many years, it will get pretty deep and granular. On the next slide, for on-premise is a very difficult channel to measure. We're excited that we partnered with a company called CGA Strategy that's been doing on-premise measurements in Great Britain for many, many years. And we started a partnership with CGA a couple of years ago, and through a lot of complexity, we were able to launch our service last year, and we're able to report on the on-premise for each of these census regions. So each of those, for instance, Pacific or Mountain or Western or Central, etc., as well as several local markets, 6 of them, Los Angeles, Denver, Dallas, Chicago, Boston, New York City, so 6, and Dallas, so 6 local markets as well as those census regions as well as a total US number. Okay, so let's look at a couple of the numbers on the next slide. Here we're showing for the latest 52 weeks, on the left-hand side, the off-premise growth rates for beer, wine, and spirits on both volume and dollars. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the comparable numbers for the on-premise for beer, wine, and spirits. So just a few things kind of off the top. Off-premise, so those are the numbers on the left, are growing better than the on-premise side of the chart for a number of reasons. Some of those are economic reasons, some technology related, some competitive reasons, but off-premise is generally growing a bit faster than on-premise. Beer is trailing wines and spirits growth, and beer's share of adult beverages has pretty well declined almost relentlessly from close to 60% of servings in the early 2000s to less than 50% today. And that's within an overall beverage alcohol category that's worth at retail about $235 billion. The third thing is that if you look at the dollar growth rates compared to the volume growth rates, dollar growth is generally better. And that's largely as a result of consumers increasingly trading up to more expensive product segments pretty well across the board, whether we're looking at beer, wine, or spirits, or if we get down to cider, which we will, same thing's happening there. And then one other benchmark, it says here total CPG, and CPG stands for consumer packaged goods, flat. So all of this is against the context of an overall consumer packaged goods environment where growth is pretty tough to get. So anytime we're seeing any growth, that tends to be better than the overall sort of consumer environment. So let's look at cider if you go to the next slide. So here again, we're looking at off-premise on the left-hand side, on-premise on the right-hand side. On the on-premise side, which Matt is going to talk to, you can see dollar growth of a little over 1%, so that's a nice green number. Not so much on the left-hand side, where we're looking at total cider being down about almost 10%. And that's where we really, really need to go deeper to get at all the facts that lie beneath the surface. And that's where what I'll call the long tail story comes into play. So what's the long tail story? Next slide. The market that we're competing in, flip to the next slide, there we go. The market that we're competing in and the consumers that we're competing for are increasingly becoming more diverse and more fragmented. If you just think about things like the shrinking middle class, if you think about things like multicultural growth, if you think about things like the huge generational diversity between younger and older generations and how they look at things, how they shop for things, what they value, et cetera, there's some pretty distinct differences. And as a result, there's a lot more product choices available to satisfy what has become an increasingly fragmented consumer base. If you think about, again, younger generations who almost desire that diversity of choice, we all have infinite access to information online about those choices. Younger generations are increasingly comfortable shopping for products in very different ways than past generations, and value products that, for instance, have attributes like local attached to it or artisanal attached to it. And all that fragmentation has led to this longer tail economy. So let's put that into some numbers on the next slide. in many, many categories, and beverage alcohol is really no exception, large brands of the past are just not selling as much as they once were, and the long tail is growing in importance. So what you see here is the category volume contributed by the top 25 brands in 2016, or sorry, in 2010. That's the first column. Then the next column, 6 years later, a large number of those brands are actually smaller now in sales than they were in 2010. And then on the next column, the aggregate of those same 25 brands now is significantly smaller today than it was in 2010. And if we look at today's top 25, it's a smaller contributor to category volume than the top 25 of 2010. And that's all a result as of a significant amount of volume that's being transferred from those top brands to the long tail. And similarly, we see the same thing in cider. So let's look at that on the next slide. So in the cider category, there are obviously a group of brands led by Angry Orchard, but also including a number of cider brands marketed by the larger beer companies. And they're very, very significant in overall size and importance to the cider category. And at the same time, there's a significant and growing long tail of companies and their brands that are quite large in terms of the number of brands. They're more regional, they're more local in nature. And just for today's purposes, let's call kind of that segment the craft or local segment, just to put a name on it. And just like in many other categories, it's not, both these groups can coexist all under kind of a big tent serving the consumer. So on the left-hand side, we showed you obviously some of the company names. On the next slide, just to break that down one step further, I think obviously everybody is aware, being that you're in the category, the brands that each of those larger beer companies own in the cider category. And there's a significant percentage, in fact, it's a majority of dollars that are spent on cider today from these brands, including over 50% of every dollar is spent on the number one brand, Angry Orchard. And these brands, many of them have helped over the years to build the category size and help to build awareness of the cider category. But let's sort of break down the cider category into two groups. So we're going to look at the total cider sales, and then we're going to break it down into sales coming from these brands in aggregate versus sales coming from what I call the craft or local segment. Next. So here's what that looks like. What we're looking at here are sales in each of the last 5 years, dollar sales, annual dollar sales, and you can just look at the kind of the growth of cider on the left-hand side from 2012 through to 2015, but then a pretty significant drop-off in 2016, and that's that -10 that I referred to a few slides ago. Now, if we break that down into kind of the large cider segment, you can see that in the middle, and you can see again how that built quite substantially through to 2015, but then a pretty significant drop-off in 2016. Some of that, and obviously some of this is a bit of conjecture, but also a bit of analysis, that some of that may have to do with some emphasis put on segments like hard sodas or hard seltzers from some of these same companies that are part of that cider large segment. But let's compare that to the right-hand side, which is a composite of the craft and local segment that has, over the years, continued to grow in sales. In fact, in 2016, sales from this segment were almost 40% larger than the prior year, and that's on top of pretty spectacular gains from the prior years. So we see the continued growth of the craft and local segment. And if we put that in share terms, what that looks like is a share for that craft and local segment of less than 10% in 2014, and you can see how it continues to ramp up to the point where I think it was a pretty significant milestone. If I look at the last 13 weeks, the share from that craft local segment busted through that 20% mark in the latest 13 weeks, and that's through the end of February. So pretty significant continued gain and continued penetration of the entire cider category. Now, 17.6, if we look at these numbers, this is from all of the channels that we measure in total. There's actually some pretty distinct differences by channel on the next slide. So that 17.6 overall, if we look at just within the liquor channel, the craft and local segment is actually almost a third of the category in liquor stores and over a fifth of the category in food stores. So other channels are much less so, but certainly those are the two kind of key channels where a lot of the volume is done and where craft and local brands have had even the largest performance, the best performance, and those are our largest retail channels. Next slide. So local, I mean, it's certainly a major factor driving sales. And if we talk to consumers and ask them or put some statements in front of them like we did a couple months ago when we asked them about their preference for things like local and are you purchasing more craft, you can see that local is certainly a factor driving sales. Quite a large percentage, almost 2/3 of consumers, of cider consumers, they prefer to purchase from local cideries, and they've been purchasing more craft cider. Again, almost 2/3 of cider consumers that we've talked to said lately, I've been purchasing more craft ciders. So certainly that's a major factor. And on top of that, I think it's noteworthy that that segment also comes at a significant price premium that consumers are willing to pay. So if we look at the next slide, what we've done here is looked at the price comparison of the craft and local cider segment compared to the price of, say, beer, the price of flavored malt beverages, the average price of craft beer, and the average price of the sort of the bigger of the cider brands from the bigger beer companies. And we've indexed all of that to the average price of beer as 100. So what this says, that 205, says that the average price of a local or craft cider is about double, which is the 205 index, what the average price of beer, and its price is almost 30% larger than the average price of the cider brands marketed by the big beer companies or the average price of craft beer. And that's good really for everyone in the distribution pipeline. First of all, consumers are willing to pay for it, and that's good from a profit and margin perspective for you, for the distributor, or the retailer along the way, given that the price premium. Okay, so I'm going to sort of segue a little bit. So far, we've only looked at national numbers. There's obviously very significant regional differences, and I really think that one of the great opportunities for cider is to continue to be strong in the areas where cider is already strong and grow there, but also to build consumption levels more evenly across the country. So if we look at the next slide, if we compare the size of cider to beer, cider is still pretty small. It's just over 1% as large as the overall beer category. Beer is obviously huge in size. That's also quite a long way behind the size of cider compared to beer in some other European countries where we measure both categories. Way, way, way behind in Great Britain, no surprise, but also a bit behind in France and Spain if we compare the size of cider to the size of beer in those particular countries. But at the same time, on the next slide, within the markets that we can break out separately, there are a variety of states or local markets where cider share of beer is significantly larger than that overall 1%. So cider, it's more than 3 times higher in the states that I'm shown here in green, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Maine, and Virginia. And it's 2 to 3 times higher in several other ones. And some of those other ones are spread across around the country, inclusive of some markets within California, like San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, also way over in the other coast. You can see some eastern and southeastern markets, some in the northeast. So again, there's some pretty good disparity or spread where cider is significantly larger as a percentage of beer than the 1% national number. I also like to compare cider to something a little bit smaller than total beer, which is the flavored malt beverage segment. That's the one where the Mike's Hard, for instance, would play, or Lime-A-Rita, Reds, some of those products. So if we look at the next slide, if we compare cider to the size of flavored malt beverages, cider is about 20% as large as flavored malt beverage nationally. But again, in some markets, the gap is significantly smaller. And even in some markets, the one market that stands out in Portland, cider is actually bigger than the flavored malt beverage segment. Almost as big in Seattle, 80 to 90% as big in Washington, D.C. and Denver, and then about 70 to 80% as large in San Francisco and Vermont. So there are some markets today where the cider category is getting up close to or even surpassing in at least one instance the size of the flavored malt beverage category. And I sometimes wonder, I know that flavored malt beverages gets a lot of attention. Shouldn't cider get as much attention, especially in markets where we're already as large as or almost as large as flavored malt beverages? And then if I add on sort of the growth element, while overall the cider segment, I showed that -10, that's inclusive of all the brands in the category. If we look at the next slide, please. The cider category is actually growing in several regional markets. If you look at the left-hand side, even the total cider category, inclusive of all brands, is growing in several markets. On the right-hand side, if we exclude the number one brand, what's remaining for cider is actually growing in a number of other markets. And I think when I looked at it, and I think is pretty nice about the list, is that it's extremely diverse regionally, almost covering every part of the country where there's some growth in some local markets. We've been talking a little bit about some comparisons of cider compared to the cider size compared to beer and to flavored malt beverages. When it comes down to an actual retail store, and I'm just going to, on the next slide, if you'll move to a genie, I'm going to show just some pictures, and these are based on some pictures that I just took in some stores. On the left-hand side are some stores that I went into, and frankly, it was really, really hard to find ciders. And it's, they're there, but they're kind of mixed into the larger beer segment or mixed in with other flavored malt beverages, and it was tough to find. On the other hand, in the stores on the left I went to, it might have been a little tough to find, but there was signage at least. I knew where the cider section was because the signage told me where it was. And at least it said, hey, here I am, and it was easier to find. So wherever we can get a little bit more direction for the consumer, I think that's obviously helpful so that it becomes less of a treasure hunt and easier to find, where I can find the cider section. And then on the next slide, if you can do it even one better with things like samplings or tastings or displays in stores, those really help to drive consumer attention to exactly the right place. So I know those costs, those are more intensive in terms of resources, costs, et cetera, but they really do help drive sales. Okay, if you go to the next slide. I'm going to break that down just a little bit further because we can sort of take a look at total cider and then look at within cider kind of what different segments, what their sales are, what their share is, what their growth is, et cetera. So when I looked at cider flavors, and on the very left-hand side, we found several flavors within cider where they were growing faster than other sorts of flavors. So the ones like pineapple, cherry, blackberry, honeydew, and cranberry, those were the top 5 flavors where the dollar gains year on year were higher than some of the other flavors that we were also measuring. And something like this whole flavor thing, it's not just a cider trend. Flavors are big in spirits now. They're big in vodka. They've been getting a lot bigger in whiskey. They're actually growing fast within the craft beer category, especially within IPAs, where they represent about flavored IPAs represent about 7% of the IPA segment in total. And just for comparison's sake, the best $5 gains in craft beer from a flavor perspective are from grapefruit, mango, tangerine, pineapple, and watermelon. And maybe some of those flavors offer some potential for some flavored ciders as well. On the next slide, cider sales, of course, they're not even throughout the year. So I mentioned at the beginning that we can look at cider from a sales to consumer perspective each and every week and sort of look at what that looks like on a week-to-week basis. So how you would interpret this slide is if the average weekly period is 100, the blips above the 100 line represent weeks where cider sales to the consumer surge. And if I just sort of put a holiday calendar against it, there's obviously a great correlation. So that would say if one wanted to kind of maximize exposure during weeks where cider sales generally are higher anyway, you should gear those promotions in advance to take advantage of that sort of holiday pattern. So things like around Memorial Day, July 4th, Thanksgiving, Labor Day, those would tend to be the peaks for the cider sales. Here's some other ways we've broken down the category. And by the way, all of this will be available to you so that as I go through these, in some cases rather fast, you'll be able to look at it at your leisure. If you go to the next slide, so we've looked at the cider category in a number of different ways beyond just total and beyond just sort of large brands versus the craft or local segment. I've actually, in this slide, excluded the number one brand since it would substantially influence some of the breakdown. But when I look at what's remaining and sort of look at the category in a number of different ways, on the top left-hand side, it's by ABV. So about 60% of the sales, cider sales, are in the 5 to 6% ABV range, and then the remaining is both from the lower ABV side as well as the higher side. 26% for less than 5, 16% for greater than 6. On the bottom left is cans versus packages. Cans versus bottles. So bottles are about 3/4 of the category, cans are about 1/4. On the top right-hand side are the can and bottle size. So the 12-ounce size is about 75% of the category, and the remaining is broken out between 16-ounce and 22-ounce. And then on the bottom right-hand side is the pack size. So about 70% of sales are based on a 6-pack package, or six count within the overall carrier. 16% within the 12 carrier. The 4 count would be about 14% of sales, and then the remaining in that small sliver that's remaining. And we can look at sort of cider sales in these different ways, and attach sort of growth rates to it to help sort of guide which segments are growing and which ones may not be growing as much. Okay, let's move to the next slide. We did some consumer surveys as well in preparation for CiderCon. We asked consumers a number of questions. One of the questions we asked is just simply, how often do you drink beer, wines, and spirits, and ciders? And then we're able to break that down by age group and by gender. So if you look at the red column, those are those who drink cider at least several times a year. And what's showing here is the percentages of people who say they do that. If you look at sort of by age range, it starts off pretty high in the 21 to 34 group, about 40% of consumers say they drink cider several times a year. And then as you move across the page by age, it increasingly declines, where it starts getting pretty skimpy amongst especially boomers and seniors. So we do well with younger consumers, and that falls off pretty quickly as we move towards older consumers. On the very right-hand side, we showed the same, but for male versus female. And we certainly do, as a category, a better job in minimizing the gender gap, certainly in comparison to beer. So the beer gap, and the beer numbers are in green. If you look at the gap between males and females for beer, it's pretty significantly larger than that same gap, which is the cider gap between male and female, which is in red. So that's certainly one of the virtues of the cider category compared to beer, is that gender is less of a differentiator. We get some good consumption from both genders, not so much in the case of beer. On the next slide, if we break down frequency even more and look at those core consumers, so these are ones who drink cider not just several times a year, but several times a month or more often than that, and that's the red bar. Again, we do pretty well in 21 to 34, but then it starts to drop off as we move across the page. In that 35 to 44 group, that's a pretty substantial hunk of consumers that claim to drink cider several times a month or more. If I actually broke that down a little bit more into males versus females, we do better amongst males 35 to 44 than we do amongst females. And I mean, perhaps it's because females start to turn a little bit more to wine. Not quite sure. But again, if we can, I mean, this certainly says that who our core consumer is, 21 to sort of 44, males and females, a little bit better with males, but it also suggests if there's anything we can do, excuse me, to interest those people that are age 45 plus, that's obviously a large number of consumers that just aren't drinking a lot of cider. On the next slide, we also asked not just how often are you drinking, but are you drinking more or less or about the same amount of hard ciders you did a couple of years ago. And the green says these are people that say they're drinking more cider than a couple of years ago. You're doing great with the 21 to 34 group. And within that, you're even doing better amongst males 21 to 34. So that's certainly, again, a core group that says not only are they drinking a lot, but they're drinking more often than they did a couple of years ago. We also asked on the next slide, which flavors of hard cider do you prefer? Apple, of course, that's a no-brainer. But a large number said apple with added spices, for instance, cinnamon, ginger. 19% said pear, and then 15% said other fruit flavors. So there's certainly some appetite for different sorts of flavored ciders that we're seeing, and that's also, as I pointed out, an area of growth within the category. Next slide. We also asked people who said they didn't drink a lot of hard ciders, why is it that they're not drinking hard cider? 40% said they didn't like the taste, 19% said they didn't know enough about it, and then there were some smaller percentages as they move across towards the right of the page. So I would say, to me, it says clearly there's an education opportunity, especially for the 20% that just say they don't know enough about it. And a part of that education includes educating consumers about the versatility of the products that you offer. That might also address some of the taste negativities, because maybe they just haven't tasted something they might like because they don't know about what they some of the options they'd have to buy. Okay, the next slide. Here we're looking just from a, where are the opportunities for cider to be sold? And this is obviously beyond your tasting rooms and things like that. So these are more on the retail side. And I made the comparison here to the number of beer locations. And I'm assuming that if a location can sell beer, it could potentially sell cider. This says that there are 240,000 off-premise retail locations across the country that sell beer today, and that continues to grow versus, over the years. So you can see the comparison versus 2012. And there are 383,000 on-premise opportunities, which also continues to grow. So lots of places where your products could be sold. And it's sort of interesting as well to look at what are the channels where the number of locations is growing the fastest. So not sales volume, but numbers of locations. On the left-hand side, it's sort of the two opposite ends of the spectrum. The limited assortment stores, probably not a great opportunity for cider, but the natural and gourmet type stores certainly are an opportunity for us. And then on the on-premise side, things like sports bars, premium bars, theaters, which encompasses things like movies and concert areas, and the fast casual dining segment are the channels that are growing the fastest. And we presented these as kind of like off versus on, very distinct segments. If you go to the next slide, as you're aware, that sometimes it's tough to figure out on versus off premise. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see in several locations across the country going into a retail store, these are on-premise locations, or sorry, off-premise stores, but on-premise type locations within the store, where people can go and shop, but also sit down and have a light meal and order some alcoholic beverages along with their meal. And those are certainly growing in importance. And then the last thing, and I'm just going to go touch on this really, really quickly on the next slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Matt. I would just advocate that anybody involved in the category starts to get familiar, if you're not already, with the online opportunities that could be available to you. Obviously, e-commerce is growing across almost every category. It's very underdeveloped or less developed than alcohol today, but it's growing just like it is in other categories. And it will continue to grow, and it'll continue to get larger in terms of overall sales. And as more consumers sort of turn to online options for doing certain things, you want to make sure that you're aware of what those options are and where it makes sense for you to be involved in those. And on the last slide, if we sort of look at things way down the road, and this is grocery in total, not particularly for cider, but if we look at grocery in total, our forecast is that by 2025, which isn't that many years off, that the share of online grocery spending could reach 20%. If you put that into dollar terms, that's $100 billion in consumer spending. That's the equivalent of almost 4,000 grocery stores. And you don't want to miss out on what those opportunities might be as some consumers sort of move a little bit away from brick and mortar and more into online. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to cover the on-premise.
Okay, thanks, Danny. If you can just click onto the next slide for me. Okay, yes, so as Danny has said, we now have on-premise services available here in the US. And just to give you a little bit of background before we get into the full data and the cider trends that I'm going to show you, CJ Strategy, we're a company from the UK. We've partnered with Nielsen, and it's all about bringing our best-in-class methodology, which we've mastered over 30 years in the UK, over to new territories, of which the US is one of those. In this presentation, I'm going to talk you through some of our measurement data, so simply how the categories are performing in the eating and drinking channels, and then we've also got a consumer service which lets us look at how different consumers are treating the cider category and how that differs to beer. Okay, you can click next. So firstly, I just wanted to show you the universe that we measure and exactly what's going on in terms of the on-premise at an outlet level. So all the data I'm going to show you today is based on the eating and drinking accounts. Okay, so it's all about pubs, bars, restaurants and nightclubs essentially. Our data doesn't include hotel bars, it doesn't include casinos, it doesn't include stadiums. It very much is just the high value, the traditional on-premise channel that we look at. Another reason why I show you this slide, apart from just the information of what we're measuring, is to give a bit of context in what is happening in the on-premise, because it very much is a very fluid market and it's always changing. You often hear a lot of sort of doom and gloom about the on-premise in the trade press, etc., and how difficult it is to sort of grow there, and that certainly is a challenge. But from this slide, this is just simply outlet numbers. There's around 300,000 eating and drinking accounts out there at a total US level at the moment, and that is actually slightly in growth, so up 0.4%. Now, where the real insight comes is when we drill down lower and we look at another level below that. And what you can see is that it really is that eating channel where we're seeing a lot of the growth. Casual dining, such a massive number, 208,000, responsible for the vast majority of the on-premise here, still in growth. But what we're seeing on the flip side of that is the neighborhood bar in decline. So actually, across the last 10 years, we've seen 1 in 6 neighborhood bars close in the US market. So that obviously poses a big challenge to certain categories. If we just go on to the next slide, we can see here that it's beer that's been affected. So what I'm showing you here is volume and value trends for these total mega categories across the eating and drinking channels from the last 52 weeks trend. Okay, so beer we see, and this is including cider numbers, we're going to break out the category on the next slide, but beer basically is down 2% volume and down 0.8% in terms of value. One of the main reasons behind that is the sort of the decline of big beer, so the big domestic premium brands. In terms of the other categories, just to give a bit of context, we're seeing wine perform quite well, so that's fairly flattish. Sparkling wine and rosé wine really doing well there, you know, particularly the likes of Prosecco, really seeing huge growth in the on-premise at the moment. And then spirits is the big winner. So premiumization happening here, value outperforming volume. We're seeing lots of upsells into cocktails and, you know, flavor profiles really doing well, flavored spirits helping grow that category. Okay, so next slide, we're going to look a little bit more in depth at the actual beer category and see how cider is performing within that. So as you can see, cider is responsible for 1.8% of all volume within the beer category, and its volume is slightly down, but its value is actually in growth. So value is up 1.2% versus this time last year. So it's a good story for cider. Just to look at some of the other categories there, as I mentioned previously, we're seeing domestic premium in decline, and that's largely down to sort of the big mainstream brands, particularly in that packaged format. Again, you know, if we go back to neighborhood bars, which we're seeing in decline, the packaged beer format is often, you know, synonymous with there, and that's why we're seeing decline there. Craft, the big growth with craft has slowed down quite a bit, and that's obviously having an impact on beer too. But where the growth is very much within imports at the moment, particularly Mexican imports. We're seeing some great growth for those brands within the on-premise, but also from imports from Belgium, Ireland, etc. Going on to the next slide. So within cider itself, what is actually growing that plus 1.2% value? Because it's quite a fragmented category. So very similar to what Danny showed in the off-premise, what we've done here is purely for the on, we've looked at what the top 3 cider brands account for. Those mainstream brands, they account for about 46%. Now, if you actually took those brands away from the category, you'd see that the category would instead grow to plus 7.7%. So it very much is that long tail, those smaller, craftier cider brands, which are showing the growth in the on-premise at the moment. Okay, next. I wanted to look at this data from another point of view as well. So what we've done is we've split cider by draft and packaged, and you can see here that there is a great difference in terms of where the growth is occurring. And you can almost mirror this for the beer category as well. We're seeing draft really perform well, up 4%, whereas packaged is where, you know, there's such intense competition, so many different brands in the fridge. Cider is having a harder time stand out there in the fridge, and it's down 12%. Now, the fight for draft tap handles is an intense one. Some of the work we've done with some of the large manufacturers since coming over to the US is focused on better assortment, and the next slide shows a little bit more of that. So what we have here is, just to explain the slide, is this is the average US back bar front bar as things stand at the moment. So the blue numbers is share of tap handles and the green is share of draft volume. So what you'll see here is craft beer is responsible for 58% of all taps and it contributes 42% of all volume. So it is, on average, slightly overfaced at the moment within the US on-premise. Now, if we go down to other, which we've grouped cider into, so it includes FMBs, etc., but it very much largely is cider which is contributing to that, we see that cider is underfaced. So this is a great draft selling story for cider manufacturers in terms of improving accounts assortment and making sure that that draft offer really does work for them. Okay, if we can move on to the next one. Now, within our service at the moment, Danny said right at the start of the presentation some of the markets that we can break out and we can split out. We have 6 major markets that we can drill into. Now, out of these, what you'll see is that the main ones which are experiencing growth are Chicago and New York. So when we split cider into sort of the big urban areas and then the more rural areas, it really was the major cities where we're seeing cider grow, which is no surprises really. Often, you know, trends will start there and then proliferate through, but it's Chicago and New York out of our 6 markets which are seeing the greatest growth. Chicago up 3.4, New York up 1.5. The next slide looks a little bit at what's driving that. So it really is distribution, which is really showing this, helping gain the category volume. So we've seen that cider itself is up 3.2% in terms of distribution. We know that the total universe is up about 0.8, so it's outperforming the total on-premise universe. And out of the 6 major markets we measure, it's only Los Angeles where we're not seeing the category grow. So a little bit more work to do there, but the other major sort of urban conurbations that we measure, seeing great distribution growth. Okay, next slide. So what we've got here now is, aside from the measurement stuff that we've already looked at, is a bit more of a view about what the actual typical cider consumer looks like in the on-premise and how they compare to the beer consumer. Next one. So what this is from our consumer survey, we can basically measure what the average cider drinker looks like versus what the average beer drinker looks like. Now, just to take each bucket in turn, we know from this survey that the cider drinker is often younger, so 54% of them are in that millennial age bracket compared to 37% for beer. They earn more money on average, so that's average income per household. They are more male than they are female, but exactly like in the off-premise, the split isn't as great, so there is a greater female opportunity within cider than there is in beer. And cider drinkers, is important to know, they do eat out and drink out a lot more than the average beer drinker does. Now, this obviously is a huge opportunity because it means that you guys can attract them, but also a challenge because they're quite fickle, they're going out a lot, they want to try new brands. And that helps me relate to the next slide, which shows how many new brands per year cider drinkers are willing to try compared to beer drinkers. So cider drinkers, on average, will try 4.1 new drink brand per year, and that's obviously greater than the beer drinkers, which is 3.3. So again, if you're trying to get someone to try a new brand, then it really does work for cider. But where the challenge is keeping them with you because they are often more fickle than the beer drinker. Next slide. So just to really hammer home this point, what we do in our survey is we ask people a series of statements and we get to see whether people agree with them or disagree with them or not. So when we ask people if they actively seek out new drink brands, cider, 38% of cider drinkers said that they do, compared to just 23% of beer drinkers. So it very much is a category where people are always looking to try new stuff. Now, on the flip side of that, if we look to I am loyal to my favorite drinks brands, it would be hard for me to change my mind, beer is 6%, whereas cider is 2%. So again, it just comes back to it's an opportunity, but there's also a challenge there too. Okay, next. So this was one thing which I just wanted to throw in here, which is something a little bit different. Obviously, competition is so intense in the on-premise. We realise, you know, that supply is there, demand often is falling. So what can retailers and manufacturers work together to do to create a little bit of something new and bring some excitement around the category, particularly the cider category? So we asked in our survey how prevalent cider cocktails were, and they actually scored better than beer cocktails did. So we've split this by the different age groups. So 22% of people said they would be willing to try a cider cocktail compared to just 20% of beer flavored cocktails. So it just shows here that this category can be flexible and there may be, you know, something a little bit different to do in terms of serve to really help cider stand out in a very packed and crowded on-premise. Okay, next one. So just a couple of slides for me to finish off before I hand back to Danny. Cider obviously is very big elsewhere in the world, particularly in Great Britain. If we click onto the next one, what we can see here is, so 18% of consumers who we asked said they would drink cider out of home. This increases to 28% in the UK. So obviously within the UK, it's very much is more of a heartland there. We see that cider is treated a little bit differently in France as well, more like a wine rather than a beer. If we click onto the next one, I can talk you through some of the trends from Great Britain. So what we have here, very similar to the US, similar sort of growth levels, slightly more at the moment, and what's driving that is the draft ciders compared to packaged. But what's happened in the UK, which hasn't really taken off as much over here, is flavoured cider is really helping lead the growth for this category. So we're seeing, across packaged and draft, some of the large major cider brands there launching flavours. Now, there is a great debate between some, cider professionals whether this is still classed as cider once you put so much flavouring in it or not, but it's on the label that it is, and that's what the consumer is often viewing it as. So this is also an opportunity for potential growth that the category can develop a little bit further through adding flavours. Okay, so the last one from me is just a quick little summary of the on-premise before I hand back to Danny. So it is positive. It's positive news. So we're seeing cider in growth. Beer is in decline, but cider's value is growing, and what's largely because of that is the long tail. So it is those smaller brands which are helping grow. One of the main reasons why we're seeing cider grow is that it's growing in those major urban areas, Chicago and New York, and its distribution, which is really helping drive that. What does a cider drinker look like? Well, they're young and versatile, very open to new drink brands, which, like I said before, is obviously a huge opportunity, but also a challenge in keeping them loyal to a brand. They often overlap with craft beer drinkers. So again, if you look at the craft category, maybe that's something we can look to the future in, that it has obviously become so big. 30% of all on-premise sales are now craft, but the growth has started to slow down. And then the last sort of thing there is, it sort of alludes a little bit to Danny's slide of the off-premise shelf, with the cider brands being quite hard to find. I do believe personally that cider should do all it can to try and not be boxed in with the beer, particularly the FMB category, and try and stand on its own 2 feet within the on-premise. Okay, so that was a quick little on-premise section there. As Danny said, we've got all these slides to share with you, and we can answer any questions afterwards. But I'm going to hand back to you now, Danny.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm just going to end up with kind of 2 slides. One is just an overall summary from both things that Matt and I talked about. And I think the numbers, especially if you go a level deeper, still suggest that the cider category upside strong, especially if we think about the craft and local segment that's really driving growth and getting much bigger. And that leads to opportunities both off and on-premise. Things like continued innovation within the category, educating the consumer about cider and what it is, the number of different ways that cider, the number of different products that cider offers, making sure that it's visible to the consumer to generate trial are certainly keys. The core consumer, that's that 21 to kind of 44-year-old, pretty good on gender equality, but beyond that, frankly, you don't have much voice with consumers over 45 plus, so that offers lots of opportunity down the road. I suggested that at least be prepared for the online opportunities. And finally, I mean, you've got a really good story. Again, you might have to go a bit deeper than some of the media that might say cider is down, but if you go deeper than that, you'll see that the segment, especially the ones that many of you participate in, is doing quite well. And you have to tell your story and make sure that others, like retailers, distributors, consumers, know about it. So on the next slide, I'm just going to make one request. It doesn't come with it doesn't come with any strings. When a product is sold in a store, we register. We get all the information, and it comes with a code. Often we know what that code is. We've already got it coded so that we know what it is, and that's what we put together in our cider report. But sometimes we'll come across something we haven't seen before, and we need to have it coded. The way that we do that is we do a lot of stuff ourselves, but we also ask anybody that participates in the industry to make us aware of your products, even send us a UPC list so that we can look at whether we've already got it coded or not. And if we don't have it coded, all we need is to get your product's labels, a digital copy showing the back and front of the label so that we can get it coded, and that way we can make sure that our reports are as inclusive as possible. of all of your products. And the reason we want to do that is we want our information, which is used and referenced pretty widely in the industry, to be as accurate and complete as possible. So you can help us make our measurement even better by helping us a little bit and just making us aware of your products when you launch new products, etc., so that we can kind of be double sure that we're being as complete and as inclusive as possible. And then we put some emails here that you can send that information to, and I think probably Michelle will help us out a little bit and put that on the USACM website. If you go to the very last slide, I just wanted to thank you very much for all your time. I think we've left just probably not enough time for questions, but we've also got our emails here, so if anybody has any more questions that we can't get to, we'd be happy to respond to you. And with that, again, I want to thank you for your time. Hope you have a good rest of the day, and I'm going to turn it back to Jeannie.